Good afternoon. A warm welcome to Executive and Senior Management of the Northwest University, academics, support staff, students, visitors and friends of the university, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Janine Chanson. Today's event takes the form of a fireside chat with the Deputy Vice-Chancellor of Research and Innovation, Professor Frans Waanders, and a very special guest. The aim for today is to reflect on the status of research and innovation in Africa and the role of entrepreneurship, to share and gain insights from the experiences of our learned colleagues, and hopefully through this, we in the audience will be spurred on into making a difference in our own ways and in our own context to building a better world. Today's guest, Dr McLean Sibanda, is one of the greatest thinkers, and more importantly, I think, one of the greatest doers when it comes to building an innovation ecosystem. He's well known and highly respected, having held several senior technical and executive positions in both the private and public sector. He has served as an advisor and a subject matter expert internationally. He has a master's in engineering, is an admitted attorney of the High Court, a registered patent attorney, and holds a doctorate of laws. Currently, he's the managing director of Biogen Global Limited. His book, entitled Nuts and Bolts: Strengthening Africa's Innovation and Entrepreneurship Ecosystems, is a must-read if you want to understand what it takes to support innovators and entrepreneurs in South Africa. It's a story of his 7-year journey as CEO of the Innovation Hub. During the course of this event, a question will pop up on your screens. The first 5 people to correctly answer it will receive a free signed copy of this book, so do keep a watch out for it. I've been fortunate to have worked alongside McLean when we were colleagues at the Innovation Fund and the Technology Innovation Agency. I can attest firsthand the passion behind everything he does and how he inspires everyone around him. Despite the many accolades to his name, he remains a humble and down-to-earth person. It is my great pleasure to welcome Dr. McLean Sibanda. Prof Waanders, over to you to start the fireside chat.
Thank you very much, Janine. McLean, Janine actually tricked me into this. She gave me a present, your book. And that's nice, Nuts and Bolts. I started reading, but then later on, like a kid, I started at the back of the book. And there you've got a very interesting example of the styrofoam cup.
Yes.
And I just want to say you can earn the ceramic cup as well,
yes.
In spite of changes, etc. So that was very interesting to me. And then Janine said, but you are going to have the fireplace interview with McLean. And then I really started reading and progressing to the front of the book, first backwards and then from the front again. And what struck me is the type of leadership and the type of innovation, and then you've got a picture number 10 or something, where you talk about the open innovation, which is quite interesting because I discovered that when I was in the engineering faculty some 15-20 years ago, and it struck me that the amount of research being done and the small end of what we call the vuvuzela, where the innovation comes from. And then I got hold about a month ago of the Business Live article where they said how much money is spent and how little comes out of it. So to ensure that you get more out, is there better suggestions for universities to open up the back end of the vuvuzela, the big part where everything goes in and the small part coming out? Is there some idea you can suggest to us?
Yeah, thank you very much, Frans, for having me here. In a great university, doing great things. And I like the fact that you started at the back of the book, because I think you started off with a story about leadership, which quite often we tend to forget when we get into positions. And we get married into the positions, and we believe that the positions define us. And the story of Simon Sinek is one that I read very often. because it reminds one that the position is just a position. You have to do, in essence, you have to do good. You have to put your heart to making a difference. And that's why I like also the Russian philosopher Trotsky, who says that the sole meaning of life is to is to better humanity. So when the question really around universities and the role of universities is an important one, because I think all of us appreciate the fact that universities are probably the single biggest concentration of knowledge workers in our society. And the question really becomes, what is the public investing in these universities? There is research that gets done at the universities, and that research comes out in publications, because that is what we measure and that is what we incentivize. But also, I think we've seen increasingly the focus of universities around commercialization, intellectual property management, and we don't have to look very far. If we look just the COVID-19 pandemic that we're sitting with, and we look at the vaccines that are being commercialized, at least all of them have got some footprint of a university, whether it's the AstraZeneca one, which comes out of Oxford, and so forth. And I think if one dwells perhaps on the AstraZeneca vaccine, it perhaps answers the question around this funnel, around open innovation, and because the whole concept around open innovation is that you're not innovating, you don't have to come up with all the ideas yourself, but there's other people outside that are also thinking about exactly the same problem. And in the case of AstraZeneca and Oxford, AstraZeneca was working on this, Oxford was working on this, and they went out, and that partnership becomes quite key. And therefore, universities need to be looking to society, to entrepreneurs, to business, and also to other universities to figure out whether there are complementarities in terms of bundling their own intellectual property and research, and that is happening outside, to be able to contribute to society.
If I can then ask, you mentioned also in your book about the pharmaceuticals contributing in South Africa. I'm not sure, was it South Africa or the world, 1.4%. Do you think COVID has increased this contribution? What's your view on that?
So COVID hasn't increased the contribution. I think what the COVID pandemic has in essence done is it has made us realize the challenge that we sit with, which is one of access to health, access to whether it's therapeutics, it's diagnostics, and so forth, which is why there is this debate around, do we do a TRIPS waiver? Do we go to the World Trade Organization and say waive intellectual property rights on COVID vaccines, on diagnostics, and so forth. But also in the book, I talk about the importance of this sector, the biosciences, biopharmaceutical sector, because it takes time to develop innovations in this sector. As many of us are aware, the vaccines have to go through there's preclinicals, and then there's phase 1. There's where, in essence, it's on animal models, and it gets to phase 2 on humans, phase 3, and through that phase, it's testing the efficacy, it's testing the safety, considerations, and I think for me, what I take out of the pandemic, France, is that we need to start to have a long-term vision around how Africa can provide medicines for its own people. We need to start to say, how do we develop the human resources that are going to come up with these innovations? How are we going to develop our manufacturing capacity? And within the framework of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, how do we then facilitate the movement of these medicines and diagnostics and so forth into the rest of the continent?
Okay, Africa Day was celebrated 25th of May. You were involved, you got innovation prizes, Africa, Young African Leadership Initiative, etc. And what do you think is the startup scene in the rest of Africa? We've talked a little bit about South Africa, but the rest of Africa.
So, Africa is a beautiful continent, and it's a continent that is pregnant with opportunities.
Mm-hmm.
It's the growingly, I think it's probably the most youthful continent. Over 70% of Africa's population is under the age of 35. And it's projected that it's going to continue to grow, particularly the youth under the age of 24, well into 2060. Mm-hmm. The rest of the world is aging. And what we're seeing in the continent are young people that are looking to make a difference. These are young people that have never used a fixed line telephone because they were born into cell phones. It's young people that, in essence, regard data as being a human right. Because they use data to connect with other young people and to connect to the world. They use data to find information. But increasingly, these young people are using data and technology to come up with innovations. East Africa, led largely by Kenya, Rwanda, Uganda, as well as Tanzania, they are leading the continent in terms of innovations. I was in Nairobi 3 weeks ago. In a great startup scene, there's a lot of venture capital money that is going into that part of the continent. West Africa, Ghana, Nigeria lead in essence, and Cote d'Ivoire in terms of the startup scene. We're seeing also North Africa, Morocco, and Egypt are leading. Southern Africa, obviously South Africa is leading, but also our neighbors, Botswana, Zimbabwe, Zambia, the startup scene is actually quite vibrant. And I think what perhaps excites me about the continent is that these young people are not just coming up with frivolous innovations. They're coming up with innovations that address the challenges that they face at the coalface. But also increasingly, these are innovations that can be exported into the rest of the world. And some of the things that are missing, however, is the R&D spend by governments is still below 1%, and that needs to increase. But what is, I think, quite enlightening, and also promising is the fact that there are Africans in diaspora in the US, in the UK, and everywhere else that have succeeded in whatever they're doing, and they're coming back into the continent, either to be part of the startup scene or to fund these innovations that they're actually seeing in the continent.
And tell me, the indigenous knowledge of the African. The Noordwes-Universiteit is lucky to have a branch at the Mafeking campus, but you believe they can at least assist in expanding the indigenous knowledge to become beneficial.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, when we have challenges, like as we do now, I think all hands on deck become quite important. It's important for us to deploy, all the ammunition that we have. That's what President Cyril Ramaphosa said, the other day, trying to convince the rest of the world to open up in terms of the TRIPS agreement. But indigenous knowledge systems are very important. because there is evidence that points to the fact that it works. I think the challenge is, how does one scale that up? How do you then make it more accessible to the rest of the world? I mean, there's great stories, whether it's Yehudia, that the Sand people used to eat, and they would then go on for for longer periods without necessarily needing water, or it's other plants that they ate that were natural sweeteners, but also from a medicine point of view. At some point there was a conversation around what this plant they call mhlonyane, where Madagascar was actually saying it's good for COVID, you take it and what have you, but the evidence is the fact that you can take this plant and you can steam with it. It does help to for the flame to actually go down, and helps with with the breathing. So indeed, I think there's a need for us to harness the value that lies in the indigenous knowledge systems, whether it's in pharmaceuticals, it's in food, and even in the creative industries, music, and the like.
And then you were one of the founders, if I remember correctly, from your book of ICASI. Did the nuts and bolts get there together, and can the universities contribute?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, I get quite passionate about talking about ICASI Labs, because so when I started off at the Innovation Hub in 2011.
Sorry to interrupt you. Maybe for those that listen in, what was the ICASI? Maybe just explain a little bit. Thank you.
Yeah. So the Innovation Hub itself, many people know it as a 60-hectare site in Pretoria. On the one side, CSIR, the other side, the University of Pretoria, CSIR. And we did whatever we could in the repositioning. The book actually talks about my first 45 days and the first year and so forth. But we realized, Frans, that we were catering to innovators, but we were not, in essence, getting in touch with a majority of young people in the townships that had great ideas, that wanted to be part of solving the many challenges that our country faces. And so we teamed up with the city of Tshwane. We put together a concept. One of my interns worked with me to put together this concept around ICASI Lab. And so ICASI is like at home, in essence. It means the townships. And so we launched this concept of ICASI Lab being an innovation center in the township. And the whole design was that we didn't want to build a whole science park, because there's a cost to that. We didn't have money. So how do we then capitalize on infrastructure that exists, municipality infrastructure? And we needed to also put in place the same high-speed bandwidth connectivity that we have at the Innovation Hub, provide exactly the same mentorship and coaching that the entrepreneurs at the Innovation Hub get, and provide it in essence in the townships, and also provide some spaces for them to actually come in and interact and so forth. And so today there are over 10 of these ICASI labs in the townships in Gauteng. Naturally, I think Northwest province needs to actually have some of these similar concept in the townships. And so whereas the first ones were set up in municipality buildings and so forth, the later ones we partnered with the universities of technology and also the TVETs. So you'd find there's one in a TVET in Mamelodi, there's another one in a TVET in Katlehong, and so forth. So there's, in essence, I think, an important role for the universities to play in respect of mainstreaming innovation and entrepreneurship. There are incredible young people in the townships who are gifted, and all they're looking for is they're looking for a chance. They're looking for somebody to believe in them. They're looking for a space where they can come in and experiment.
You see, that's one of the issues with the universities. If you look at research and innovation, the R is always big, the amount of publications, the amount of peer-reviewed articles or book chapters or whatever the case might be. And the I is the small one.
Yeah.
And I am of the opinion the I should be big to be part of this sort of venture. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely correct, but we also need to reflect and say, where do universities come from? Universities, the mission of universities was teaching and learning, and it evolved to then research. And I guess the wisdom of those that were there before, they said, how do we then incentivize researchers to research more? And how do we then perhaps create a promotion ladder for people to move up, and therefore the publications, that's what we rewarded. But I think we're seeing increasingly the focus on the third mission of a university, which is outward looking, but also a university that asks itself, why are we doing this research? There is a need for basic fundamental research because it lays the foundation, but one needs to go one step further and say, how does a university contribute to society? And that's where the I comes in. And the I is perhaps going back and almost saying, what is innovation? And innovation is how perhaps we transform labor, we transform capital, we transform information and various resources into goods and services that are of value to society. It's how perhaps we start to solve many of the problems that society faces, and therefore we come back to the research and say, how do we then ensure that the research that we do at a university can be translated into the I? And indeed, the I is going to continue to increase.
Oh, well, let's hope that it kicks off at the Northwest University as well. I think it's very important, not only basic teaching and learning things to the community, but really the entrepreneurship, I think, because that is needed. There must be some leadership, I presume. There must be some management, etc., to get these things off the ground.
But France, I think Northwest has been quite an innovation university. I mean, I remember doing some research for WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization, a few years ago. And I found that there were more startups coming out of this university, more than others, compared to when one was actually looking at startups and the number of patents. But why is that so? I mean, you guys have been quite innovative.
That's interesting. I think there was at one stage a drive for intellectual property. It was seen as elite. It was seen as, for example, on the same level as a research paper. But the people don't get incentives. So that's why those turn down, but the spin-offs are worthwhile because you can nurture them, you can help them with leadership, with management, and then they go on their own. And as I mentioned when we were sitting waiting for this interview, that some of these are now flying alone, more or less. And really, I think it is important, and many people also believe, that's what I also want to know, that science, engineering, those are the guys giving the spin-off companies, giving the IP. Is that really true? I mean, people may be listening on humanities, on education. the same will hold there. Am I right? Or
Yeah. So, I mean, you're absolutely, correct. And I think one of the, perhaps a lesson from the story of Northwest University and spinning out, these companies without patents is the fact that although intellectual property is important, it is not everything. It's the innovation, it's how the ideas are converted into something that is of use, to society. And now, if one actually reflects, I take, and in the book, I take a more broad definition of innovation. And I think just now I basically defined innovation as far as the late Christensen defined it. And there's no technology in that definition. But we also realize that much of innovations that have transformed our modern world has been because of industrialization, and hence the science, technology, and engineering comes in. But there's a role for all the disciplines. Innovation would tend to be multidisciplinary. There's innovation that happens in the creative industries. Even if we take education, the educators are facing problems on a daily basis, and it's how they look at these problems and say, how can we make it better? So they start to innovate, and so there's innovations that comes in. Now if you team the educators, the people from humanities and the creatives together with the people from technology, that's when you get ed tech. That's when you would get, for example, ag tech, agricultural technology. And so there is a role for all the different disciplines to innovate. Patenting, however, will not happen in the humanities. It's unlikely. The humanities will probably rely more around copyright, and because it's expressions of creativity and the like. But innovation is cross-cutting. It happens every day. It happens across the different disciplines in any university.
it's interesting. If we drill closer to, you touch on it in the book as well, the IPR Act. Some 10 years ago you started, if I remember correctly, and if you could change anything about that act, because universities struggle with certain aspects of it, other people, what would you like to change?
That's a very tricky question. So one of the things that, when I started, I was actually very fortunate to start working on this piece of legislation. And when I, got called in to look at it, the one thing that we changed at the time was the fact that the first draft was focused on patents.
Okay.
And if you look at the legislation today, it talks about intellectual property, because it recognizes the fact that there is intellectual property, there is value out of software, which is not patented. There is value in terms of, we spoke about indigenous knowledge, how you actually then translate that into something that can then be commercialized. But now looking at the Act itself, the idea was anything that is of value should be protected, where it can be protected, and then commercialized to the benefit of society. I think, looking back, what would I change if I was to rewrite the Act? I think, perhaps we are now at a stage where the culture of protecting ideas has improved significantly. And, perhaps some of the authorizations by government need to be, pulled back. And this would relate perhaps to the assignment of IP. Instead of government approving through NIPMO, maybe the universities need to be trusted that they're going to do the right thing.
And so for the vaccines where we want to lift the IP, you think that would be then part of it's a positive going forward, am I correct?
You see, I think we are in a war, right? And I think we've got to ask ourselves questions around how many of these vaccines are protected by patents, and how many of these patents are in force in the countries that are most affected. And I'm told that very few of the vaccines are protected by patents. Yes, some of the tools underlying behind the vaccines, they're patented. So tomorrow, a scenario could exist where WTO, and we've seen the United States have said, we're prepared to support the waiver. The issue is not the waiver. The issue for me is not intellectual property rights. The issue is manufacturing capacity of the continent. It's technology transfer, because much of the value is not in patents, because in patents you put stuff that other people are going to read and also then try to see whether they can reproduce. But there is trade secrets, there is know-how that only the manufacturers are aware of that. That is not part of TRIPS. You can't really, ask people to show you the trade secrets. So my view is that we really need to focus on strengthening our manufacturing capacity. We need to actually strengthen also our ability to negotiate technology transfer. We saw that with the HIV pandemic. Some companies where Aspen was a beneficiary of voluntary licensing and immunity to suit by GSK. And I believe that actually gave Aspen an ability for it to boost their own manufacturing capacity. So, whereas I sympathize really with the WTO IP waiver, I actually think that we should not be distracted. We need to focus on building the capacity for us to manufacture. We should strengthen our capacity to negotiate, licenses, to negotiate so that we can able to manufacture these as easily as possible.
Okay, you were then involved in the Innovation Hub for many years, experienced. There are quite nice references from your colleagues there. But do you think something like that? I think the Innovation Hub was the first in South Africa, but the only one at this stage. Am I correct?
Yes, it was the first internationally recognized one. Today, there are hubs in Botswana, Botswana Innovation Hub. There's one in Eswatini. There is another one in Abuja. There is one in Mauritius, in South Africa. We've seen East London, IDZ. The KwaZulu-Natal government is talking around setting up 3 innovation hubs. There is also the one in Vaal University of Technology. But I think what is also important, Frans, is that we don't need to build big structures like the Innovation Hub. And I think the COVID pandemic has actually demonstrated to us that we need to think differently. What we need are smaller spaces. Look at Tshimologong, what Wits University is doing in Braamfontein, where it's focused on 4IR type of technologies. It's utilizing all buildings. So we need to really rethink how do we create these hubs, these spaces where young people can easily access them. They can connect, they can have access to tools and expensive software that otherwise they wouldn't access, but also more importantly, where they can connect to markets. and also access to finance.
But then a place like our Mafeking campus, which is a distance, you just mentioned that they should be able to connect to markets. Even if they are distant, it can still be relevant.
It can still be relevant because, you know, today the ability to move, I mean, if we take Mafeking, the proximity of Mafeking to Botswana.
Yes, yeah.
So there's a market already. But also we have to look within that whole Mafeking area and say, what industries are there? Or what industries could we create because there's a need?
That's the important one. What can we create?
What can we create? And then that's long-term thinking. And in 5 years' time, there will be less imports of certain things because in that area, the university has led in terms of spinning out startup companies that are now producing things that otherwise were being imported from China or imported from the UK, or even things that were imported from Gauteng. And now they are available in Mafeking and providing employment opportunity as well for the people in that area.
And you believe that the fees must fall, the free funding of education has put the universities in some instances in dire straits. That should not hamper these things to develop.
You see, I think the fees must fall movement. It's a very important movement because it's a promise that the country made. We made that promise to our young people in 1994. I went and voted in 1994, and I think from then we've heard that education shall be free. If we look in the rest of the continent, many of the African countries, education is free. So, yet at the same time, universities are hugely in distress. So those that can afford should actually pay. But yet at the same time, I think the mission of the university around teaching, learning, research, and also serving society, the commercial aspects, that needs to remain intact. And we need to find a way that our students that we educate, whether they're educated freely or whether their parents pay, realize the importance of these institutions and at some point come back to plow back. They come back as angel investors to invest in some of the technologies that are being developed out of the universities. They come back to support student entrepreneurship, and so forth. So I think we need to take a longer-term view, and I think we will find our way as a country.
It's interesting. I just got we are trying to get some questions from the audience, and there have been some problems connecting. I trust everyone's on par now. They know exactly what we were talking about.
Yeah.
And one of the questions was what's quite interesting. How do the players in South Africa innovation ecosystem, how do the players in the South African innovation ecosystem become more integrated in the continental ecosystem? What are low-hanging fruit for us?
So I mean, there's quite a lot of things that are happening at the moment. One sees competitions. I mean, in the book, I talk about the Innovation Prize for Africa. That was just one particular, competition. But also, I think that if I perhaps come back to the universities, there are students in South African universities that come from Kenya, from Uganda, from Rwanda, from all over the continent. And as we set up these startups, we need to be thinking around markets, the rest of the continent being a market. And we need to be building teams in these startups where we've got people from the different countries, because they become the ambassadors. They become the co-founders of subsidiaries in those particular countries. So part of the low-hanging fruit is really how we maximize, make use of the diversity that we have, not only as a country, but also the diversity in terms of the various nationalities that live in South Africa. But I think the other low-hanging fruit is really the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, or the African Continental Free Trade Area, is how, what goods can be traded, and also, I guess, it's really following the money, as well. So, part of the conversation I was having with a friend of mine is she's into education. She set up Rekindle Learning here in South Africa, and she's looking at branching out into the rest of the continent. And so part of it is really finding like-minded people in those different countries and saying, this is what we have, this is the IP that we have, can we partner with you and set up a startup in Kenya, Rwanda? You can own 50% or whatever, 40% of that particular company. We bring in the IP, and our IP gives us certain shareholding. It's a market that otherwise may only be realized in 5-10 years' time, but by doing that, you're able to realize that market in a shorter period of time.
But you mentioned quite a lot of African countries, but South Africa is not lacking behind?
South Africa, so when someone asks me, I think that, South Africa, we're doing great things, but we need to have more urgency. I'm seeing the future being in East Africa.
The reason?
I think the reason is they don't have much of the challenges that we face as a country. I think, the challenges that we face as a country in South Africa, we're still trying to address many of the inequalities that were created by apartheid, the education system. Even from a growth point of view, GDP growth, we're growing at about 2%. East Africa is growing 7%,
okay,
10%.
That's clear then, yeah.
It's a darling of the world. You get to Nairobi or Kigali, and there's just people flying in from the US that are there looking for markets, looking for opportunities. And also, as a region, the East African community is much more united, much more coordinated than SADC. And I think that will give them an opportunity.
Speaking about that, do you still believe then South Africa is, Africa as a whole is too fragmented? If you look at the US, Europe, but Africa is fragmented. Is that a issue or a problem?
Yes. So France, I think one of the things that we forget when we talk about Africa, we at times we forget that these are 55 different countries. 55 different countries, and they are diverse, different languages, different political systems. West Africa is like Francophone and so forth. So, and I think the AU is trying its best to be able to, pull these things together into something that can work and move in one direction. Uniformly. So indeed, I wouldn't compare, Africa with the United States, because the United States is one country. And in the continent of Africa, you can fit in essence, the United States, geographically.
Yes.
So So we need to, and I think the approach to development of Africa must be more on a regional basis, which is why East Africa, Southern Africa, West Africa, and North Africa actually make sense.
Oh, that's interesting. And one of the questions further relating to Africa, do you think Africa as a patent territory is too fragmented, which we just discussed? Shouldn't we discuss a single patent registry and then waiving registration fees and those sort of things?
So let me start with the last one.
Okay.
So the patent offices have got to make money because there's people that work there. They've got to be paid. And I agree around the fragmentation. So one of the things that I've been honored to be involved with was, I think it was 2006. I was part of the expert team that the African Union put together to look at the Pan-African Intellectual Property Organization. Fast forward, the constitutive documents were later adopted by the African Union. But again, we have to realize it's 55 different countries. We already have 2 organizations in Africa, OWAPI and ARIPO, that do registration. The big question is, do we really need another registration office? And my answer is no, we don't. I think what we need are perhaps more mechanisms of harnessing the intellectual property that exists, but also perhaps more awareness and promotion of intellectual property. We need to demystify intellectual property. We need to demystify the fact that patents are only things that get granted for advanced kind of innovations. So I would not put in a lot of emphasis around registration, but I'll put more emphasis around mainstreaming intellectual property. I mean, just take South Africa as a case in point. There's about 15,000 patents that get filed at the South African Patent Office. 11,000 of those are filed by foreigners. So what does that tell us? It tells us that the locals are not utilizing the intellectual property system, and therefore we need to mainstream that.
It's interesting. Maybe I think we've got some other interesting questions. Commercialization, ownership remains the issue. We can talk quite long on these type of topics, but I see they're already indicating
we're running out of time.
We are running out of time already. So it's been very stimulating for me. I'll read the book, those things I did not understand, with a better eye, not only from the back, but from the front. And I'll be glad if you can sign my book.
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
It's been a pleasure having you here. I think it was a fruitful discussion, and I'm sure those university people and even others outside might rethink and regroup to ensure that the innovation, the going forward, is the main theme, the I becoming big at the universities. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your time and trouble, and we trust you will have a safe trip back again. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Frans, and thanks to the university, and thanks to everyone that has joined us this afternoon. And you can get your copy of Nuts and Bolts.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Oh, it was quite interesting. There were 1 or 2 more questions, but they are about a page.